This is Business Therapy, healing businesses from the inside out through communication and emotional intelligence. I'm Diane Dye Hansen, management consultant, and with me is Christine Salvo, therapist, certified mediator, and certified hypnotist.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. And today, I just want to know, not that I can see your hands raised since we're over the radio, but by a show of hands, how many of you have student debt? I know I'm raising my hand.
I do.
Christine's raising hers. We have on the show today Fred Amrein, and Fred is the author of Financial Aid and Beyond, Secrets to College Affordability. He also has an accompanying course that he teaches on that as well. Welcome to the show, Fred.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. And isn't that the hot topic today? It's everyone is either loaded down in student debt or they're late career and they're thinking, wow, I really need to go back to school, but can I afford it? What does the landscape look like right now in terms of the number of people who are going out, getting loans and having to figure this out?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, the numbers that are published are out there between 44 and 45 million people affected, but you don't always hear about the other people it's affected. So, that's the people with student debt, but some are spouses that are living with those people, grandparents and parents are trying to pay for that. So the numbers are much larger than we hear about. And I think the way I look at this problem, there was four major decision points. Everyone thinks it's a one-time decision, but it's going to affect people's lives for 15, 20, 25 years.
Right.
When you think that it starts maybe in middle school or high school, up through the college years when you're incurring the debt, and then again on the back end once you're repaying it, and then once you get married or some changes in your lifestyle, that those all have impact on your payment method and your financial future.
Right,
Yeah.
Exactly. And then it's such a large amount of debt. I know me, myself, I have $100,000 in post-grad debt.
Yeah.
And how about you, Christine?
Oh, God, I don't want to say it out loud. I don't want that on public record, but let's just say I could live in a nice house.
Exactly. So, how does one go about approaching this? And, say we have someone listening right now who's pre-career, who's about to go into college, who wants to know how to structure things after they get out. What would your advice be to them, Fred?
Well, I think the first thing is understanding the debt structure is critical and often overlooked. And the college funding piece is a little bit different than traditional, payments or paying for something, because your debt structure will dictate your loan repayment options. But for parents also, it will tie them to some legal responsibilities depending on how engaged they are. So as an example, the traditional mindset is that we would defer debt as long as possible. Well, for college funding, you actually should take on the Stafford loans. That means you're going to fill out the FAFSA form. You have to fill out the FAFSA form, and I would recommend every family do that. And once you have that, you'll qualify for the direct Stafford loans. And that loan is in the student's name. Now, the problem there is it's limited to a certain amount each year, and depending on the student's academic positioning is what they'll get each year. But then once that happens, any debt above that, the parent or guardian or someone will have to be a cosigner, or if they take a Parent Plus, that is legally the parent's loan. That could cause some problems in the future because now that will show up on the credit report or a whole other slew of issues. And when you really look at the problem overall, the issue that I think is the lack of transparency. The schools, the high schools, and parents are more worried about acceptance admissions into the schools that they're dreaming of and don't see the cost. And the schools will only give you information 1 year at a time, and you have to have a plan to that outcome. What am I going to do after 4 years? And the new world that we live in, and I have children that have just gone out. I'm an old guy here. But you have to, more and more careers requiring the postgraduate studies. So my oldest is a speech pathologist.
Right.
And once she had made that decision, graduate school is required. And that's a big change for many parents in that, 50 to 60, that was a requirement when we went to school. So it's a change in the environment that we have to plan for that's not often done.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And it seems like the master's degree is the new bachelor's degree, right? Like the bachelor's degree can get you in your field, but it seems like any level of kind of expertise or management is going to require the master's, which you can't get even if you qualified for the grants, right? The Pell grants and the things that can pay for undergrad, they don't touch masters, correct?
They do not. So there are all scholarships that you have to.
Yeah.
I'm going to forget how many years ago they've taken out all of the subsidies. There is still scholarship money available. I'll be honest. My oldest is an amazing child. She actually got a full ride for her master's.
Wow.
She had done some mission work and things like that. And actually, she had we had a heart-to-heart discussion. She got into a very prominent school and gave her scholarship money, and then another school had given her a full ride. And the one who had more prominence, but came down to dollars and cents, and she made the right choice.
Yeah.
So that's a big change for many families, and I think if you can do that early on, and it doesn't need to be exact, but if you think your child's going to be in that science field or something like that, and it does change, that has to be part of the plan when you make that decision to commit to the schools.
And what does that cosigner liability look like? I imagine for parents who are unaware of that, what does that look like for them?
Well, for them, it's really kind of serious, and it's not really recognized. It will show up on their credit report. And to get off that, I mean, basically they're going to be on that for some period of time until the child's debt-to-income ratios become good enough that the bank will release the parent from that loan or the cosigner. It could be a parent, it could be a grandparent, whoever co-signed. So it's whoever the co-signer is until that initial borrower is able to justify the debt-to-income ratios and approvals. The banks don't have to let you go, and that becomes a problem.
Wow. Yeah, and that's not necessarily just disclosed to people. That's what I'm hearing from you, right?
That's true, and what you have to realize is that the student, and this is going to talk about a dependent student, the dependent student can only get about $27,000 in their name over the 4 years. Anything above that, when you look at the cost, the parents will be, or some guardian, someone else will be directly or indirectly related to that debt that's taken on. And people over 50 are the fastest growing accumulators of student debt at this point in time.
Wow. So kind of what I'm hearing from this, I'm imagining that I'm in this situation. So my daughter's 15 and a half, and college is something we're thinking about. And I'm sitting here as a parent going, I want the best for you. I want the best for you. And I'm making an emotional decision based on a long-term financial issue, right? Not even necessarily knowing if your child's going to use that degree or not, just crossing your fingers that they do. And I can see how people are kind of getting into a predicament later of like, oops, of course I have these best intentions and I want the greatest for my child, but at the same time, we have to be kind of practical here. And especially if we don't have all the information, that could be hard.
Yeah, I think, and you hit the nail right on the head there, is the emotion piece. And what happens is we don't look at this as a purchase. And if you take the mindset and understand that education is a business and that there is a cost, and again, there's the promise, the way it's marketed to many families, you go into those colleges, and this is not being good or bad against them, but they're going to promote themselves as, we gave out $50 million of financial aid last year, and everyone in the room goes, oh my gosh, we can afford to come here. And we get emotionally tied to the school and don't really understand the money and numbers.
Yeah.
And that's part of our approach that we look at is putting that transparency out at the very beginning and knowing what's affordable and knowing what debt you have at graduation before you apply. Mm-hmm. So the way the schools work it is when you fill out your FAFSA form, you get what's called your expected family contribution. And the way financial aid works, it's cost of that school minus your EFC, your expected family contribution, is what you qualify for aid, and the schools meet a percent of that, and a percent of that will be gift aid. Now that's for the need-based students. You could also have the student that gets merit aid. They're they're going for a special talent they bring to the school. Could be academics, could be sports, and that some of that calculation would be thrown out the window. But that's what we don't do well at the front end. We get emotionally tied what the program is. I want the best for my child, just as you said.
Yeah.
And we kind of forget about the money. And then we're so wrapped up, it just becomes very, very hard to break that mindset.
I totally get this picture of like, you know, you go to test drive this really fancy car that's kind of outside of your budget, you know, and they're like, oh, come on, just drive it. And you drive it and you imagine driving it. And then you're like, oh, how could I even go back to that other car I was going to drive?
Yeah, just visit the campus.
and then you end up with this expensive car that you don't like in 2 weeks with this really expensive payment, right? And I'm thinking of my daughter, right? Because she's the one closest to college. And I'm just imagining taking her to these campuses and her emotional, right, tie of like, oh, I can imagine, and this would be my dorm, and this would be where I get breakfast. Oh, please, can I? I want it, right? And then having to kind of deliver either yes, it's yours, or the no, I'm paying of disappointment of like.
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm getting
exactly
very visual here. I'm getting very
no,
visual.
that's exactly what is happening. We don't do the due diligence, and I think the biggest piece on top of that is when you buy that car or you buy that house, what you're just falling in love with, there's a third party that's saying, yes, we will let you do this. No, we won't.
Right.
In education, that person is yourself.
Yes. It's so true.
Third party to say that yes or no.
Oh, you're right.
And that's what we're trying to do here is with what we do, and is bring that transparency to say, does this make sense?
Yeah.
And keeping track of all those ancillary expenses as well, the books, the housing, the food, all the things that go with education, because when you're in school, and whether it's graduate or undergrad, your earning potential is going to drop. Most undergrads are in undergrad full time, and they might have a little job on campus or something like that, but that's not going to pay the tuition bill, and it might pay a portion of the food bill. Mm-hmm. So looking at the entire cost of the education. So what do you see as some of those ancillary expenses that drop in there that people just don't pay attention that are coming?
Well, typically what's called the cost of attendance is tuition, room and board, tuition and fees. Now you have to be careful. Some schools will add health care into that bill. And if you have, and a lot of people don't read those statements, and healthcare is sometimes added in there as part of the bill. And if you have proof of healthcare, then it will be taken off. But again, some people don't look at that bill. That's one thing you need to look at. And then they'll add in books, and they'll add in usually some travel and some personal expenses. But again, there'll be averages. When we go through processes, we recommend that you do that. And the schools have gotten to be very a la carte in that pricing, in the sense that the pre-med program versus the business major versus liberal arts could have different fees and tuitions. I'm in the dorm versus the suite versus the quad. I'm in the 15 meal plan versus the 18 meal plan. Mm-hmm. You can have a pretty big variance in some of those numbers. I live further away from home, or one of my children was homesick. They came back and forth a lot more. So where does that money come from? And what's never in the money or in the discussion is the parents' cost. So if you go further away, and now the parents have to fly and they have to stay in a hotel, and we laugh about it all the time, is a parent comes into town, and now all of a sudden they have a lot more friends because mom and dad's going to be taking them out to dinner. And now instead of dinner for 3, it's dinner for 8. So these are the little things that are not added in to a lot of costs, and you have to factor those in as you make those decisions.
So I really love that you're bringing in this parent perspective here, and you had mentioned spouse earlier, and I want to get to that in a minute. But what are you seeing, or what have you noticed, or what are some of the stories that you could tell basically about kind of like how this affects the parents in this unexpected way?
We're seeing, there was a recent study, and I'm going to not remember which one it was, but about a third of the parents are now delaying retirement. And we're going to see this getting worse because the next generation of parents are having their children later in life. So now our typical retirement plan is going to be squeezed because we've had our children later in life, and you won't have the recovery time that you typically would have had, say, in my generation.
Right.
We had our children younger, and now we have a time to recover before we want to do that. Because of the cost that it's going, more people needing graduate school, all those costs and parents co-signing and all those type of things, we're seeing a squeeze on retirement and people carrying debt into retirement much longer. That's a big change. I think the other big change that no one is really talking about is the added complication of the debt and how it's being repaid. And what I mean by that is we now have about over 54% of student debt dollars, not just people, but dollars, are now repaid using income-driven repayment methods.
Okay.
And with income-driven repayment methods, it's another big change. So we would typically think of loan repayment as looking at interest rates and terms and trying to get the lowest monthly payment. With now more people, and mostly the higher debt people, having what's called using an income-driven repayment method, it's based off your adjusted gross income. And so now managing that becomes more important than some of the terms. And that's a gigantic change. So when you get married, a married couple, as an example, could have, and they say they both have federal student debt, they could have up to 126 combinations of how to pay it back. And that's just a gigantic change.
Okay.
And it's interesting what you said about delaying retirement, because there's this extra debt that's on board. And that I like to say death is not a repayment plan, but it's true that the student debt in particular doesn't pass on in the event of a death. But that's not a repayment plan, and a lot of people forget that, and they forget that their entire lives they're going to have this burden, especially if they've co-signed. That's going to be tacked on to their burden. So how would you suggest a parent kind of have that discussion with their child that there's a real impact here, and it's not because I don't want you to go to Ivy League school A, it's because of X, Y, and Z, and we need to figure out a different way. And maybe what are the different ways?
Again, a lot has to do with transparency, and that's kind of what our mission is, or my mission is too, and trying to bring this transparency to the public and show them how they need to approach this. I think across the board there's just a lack of transparency and such an increase in complexity. As I was talking about the loan repayment options, you have this loan servicers giving you some advice, then you have to go to your tax consultants, and then you have the refinancing people, and no one talks to each other.
Right.
So now you have the public trying to get an answer to how do I pay this back the best way, and not a good place to go.
Right.
So that's one of the problems. Going out, again, having that transparency, it's hard to see that. We get this, the information isn't available as well as you would hope to see how you're going to structure that debt. When do I run out of money? So, one of the methodologies that we talk about in the book and in our process here is establishing that budget. I mean, that sounds harsh, but as I was talking about, the impact of children, your EFC number can go up and down. You could qualify for more aid. But now if you had a budget of, say, you saved $25,000 for this one child, and you can afford, let's say, $1,000 a month, so $12,000 a year, and that would include their contributions also. How does that money work out over the 4 years? Because that decision, or those shortfalls, have to be projected, and then that determines what your debt's going to be at graduation, and that will determine, how long or who's going to be paying it back.
Yeah.
And that's the methodology that we're trying to preach here and get out to the public and add that transparency that really doesn't exist at this point in time.
Yeah, I can absolutely agree with that. And I have student loans, obviously, and I'm like, I've never thought of it from that perspective. Nobody co-signed on mine, so gratefully it's all mine. But I know how it impacts my life. So I'm curious for these parents that are co-signing and the spouses, at least in my own experience, it impacts my buying ability. It impacts my ability to buy a home. It impacts my ability to have certain investments, right? And also with the repayment plan, do you notice that people are kind of trying to keep incomes low so that they don't end up with these huge student loan debts? And kind of what do you seeing like on the economic side?
So again, all of that's starting to happen. We're seeing, family starts, and that's I think the big adjustment that's starting to happen, which could be a really good thing. Companies are adding what's called a student loan assistance plan. About 5% of the companies now offer that. They're expecting that to grow over the next 2 to 3 years, up to about 35% of the U.S. companies will have that.
Wow.
We think that's a great benefit because it will bring transparency. And just as a side note, one of the problems here, too, is people are feeling so much pain. The scams around this are significant.
Mm.
So I'll give you an example. When someone calls, and we get calls, we have a few different things that we do to just see what's going on. And someone will call, and you don't think it's important, but they'll call and say, oh, can you just give me your FSID? We can help you save money on your student loans. And they say, hey, I just need your FSID and password.
Ooh.
Well, when you give that, they have your Social Security number, they have your birthday, they have your mailing address, they have your formal name, because that's part of that download.
Right.
So just be really careful when, there's a lot of pain going out, but we're seeing the delays here in family starts and home purchases, and that's why some of the companies are starting to step in and now add a benefit to relieve some of that financial stress that their employees are facing, on top of saving for retirement. So there was a private letter ruling from Abbott Labs where they have an incentive program. It doesn't reduce the debt, but they put money into the retirement account for their employees. So there's more and more companies that are doing it. There's a few company matching programs. It's the most popular. There's a few things that happen like that.
Yeah, that's progress. That's at least something in the right direction. So for students that are graduating, whatever level you are in life, looking for a company that offers that, it's probably a great idea, at least to get ahead of that. And as far as the purchasing power, do you see trends in that as well?
Again, overall, we're seeing that delay, but one option that just came up as part of the budget review is the public service loan forgiveness. I don't know what's going to happen there from a political standpoint, but that's another way if you are able to do, work for the right employer. You have to work for either the federal government or a state or local government. You can work for a nonprofit. The majority of nonprofits will qualify. And that's a way to relieve that debt if you can find a career in that path. It's not used a lot. It has not gotten good press. There's been a lot of bad information from the servicers, and this gets back to the complexity. Someone gets married, they could have a $200,000 or $300 change in their monthly payment if they don't file their taxes the right way, or someone does a refinancing, and that's where that lack of knowledge comes into play. So there's some other ways to help you. In that situation, you could have a person that's a school teacher or working as a nurse in a hospital or something like that, where they would be lowering their adjusted gross income by putting more money into the retirement plan, so they're growing assets, maybe money into their health savings account, and so they're building assets at the same time lowering their monthly payment, which is going to help their cash flow.
Right.
And you said that the biggest population going back now is over the age of 50. So how would someone go about making a smart decision, and do they go back to school?
No, it's really not them going back. It's the debt accumulation. So when I talked about people over the age of 50, it could be some people going back to get retrained because of changes. It could be. I think the majority of that is really the Parent Plus loans. As the tuition costs go up, the student legally can only get $25,000, to $36,000 in their name. Over the 4 years, anything above that, someone has to finance that. So they can have the option of a Parent Plus loan. There's two or three most popular ones. A Parent Plus loan is one, which is legally the parents. People don't recognize that. They could do a private student loan that the parent or someone's going to have to co-sign, or they could do a home equity if they have the home equity there. And there could be a few other options that again, gets into more complex issues. But that's why it's the fastest growing. Not so much it's the retraining of, it's more them trying to educate their children.
So I'm a little curious now about some personal stuff with you. How'd you get into this? Why are you so passionate about this? I love that you are. I'm learning so much from you. But it's like, of all the things in the world, I'm passionate about student loans.
So what happened is I left corporate finance. I was in planning and modeling for a very large company and decided to take the leap of faith. I grew up in a small family business in the food business, and said, hey, I'm going to go back to my roots and started my own financial planning firm. At the time, my oldest was in high school, and I think she was a freshman, or I think she was a sophomore at the time. And a good CPA friend of mine said, hey, this college thing's getting out of control with the 529 plans, with financial aid, the student debt. It's just getting really crazy. It could be a good niche. And so over the time frame, I've done a lot of work, studied a lot of different places, and that's what makes me unique. I bring together the personal financial side, taxes and all that kind of stuff. That's the course that we've authored, also on top of the book, but also the financial aid process. So understanding how, that cost attendance, what the school meets of need, how much is gift aid, what can you expect, and bring that together in financial modeling is what we do. And I see how it's going to impact my own children. Those discussions were sometimes hard, but I think it's so important for the next generation, for the financial future of a lot of people. And we've seen that increase in education need. I mean, and especially what's going on with the current virus. I mean, we're seeing the supply chain issues that we may have with medical and other things, and a resurgence maybe here in manufacturing. We're going to have more educated, more trained people in the upcoming things, but it's so expensive. It's going to be a very interesting dilemma that we face in the next 10, 15 years.
I always like to say, what an exciting time to be alive.
Isn't that a curse? May you live in interesting times.
Right? What an exciting time to be alive. Oh, yeah. So you just, in some ways you fell into it, but it seems like you really do have a passion for it. You have the knowledge for it. And I'm guessing that on some level it's benefited you in your own life, right?
You know what? I've had some really nice comments back. We've helped a lot of people, avoid some problems or just help them. And that's what's, I can honestly say we're here trying to do the right thing. And there's a lot of scams out there that people are trying to make money off of that. Granted, I need to make a living just as anyone else, but trying to do the right thing for people sometimes can be, not always the best thing, and especially with the stress that a lot of people are facing. As I said, the scams are going out there. And another, on the front end, we talked about the back end when I have the student debt. There's a lot more free sites that are being, available. When you have to create that expected family contribution, you have to disclose all of your financial information. So how much money we make, what are my assets, all that goes into that calculation. So there's a lot of free information or free sites out there. You have to put that information in, and that just gets sold to whoever it gets sold to. Now, granted, you don't have to put your personal information, but typically you're going to put your email address, and all of a sudden you're going to get bombarded by all this extra email. So, or they know where you live, or again, there's so much more tracking through the web now. So you just need to be careful.
I get calls, I don't know how many times, sometimes daily, 3, 4. Like, I'm good. Thanks for calling.
Thank you
I'm
for
good.
calling.
Anyways, I'd be really excited if I got a real call at this point.
So just to wrap up, what would you say are kind of the top, 3 to 5 things, if someone's thinking about taking on student debt, the top 3 to 5 things that they should check out or know?
I think understanding your total cost at the beginning, and how do you plan to pay for that? Will you qualify for aid? So for a family that has multiple children, maybe that EFC number can go up and down, and they may qualify for aid in some years. That's an important part to know. How you're going to pay that and how the debt's going to be structured is very, very important. And again, it gets harder to do this. All this transparency isn't available. This is what we have a passion to do or create. Is understanding what the repayment options are going to look like. How much money is it? Who's going to be paying for this? What are my repayment options? Again, we talked about the married couple. If it's graduate school debt, it's very different than it'd be undergraduate debt. So understand your repayment options. And another important part is looking at the career. I think the schools at times really factor on being a happy person, which I agree with fully. But we don't see, this is what I want to get this job or whatever, and we don't understand what what the demand is, and what does that job pay, so that I can feel happy.
True.
Yeah, what's the payoff here to this investment? Right.
Is it going to pay? How can our listeners find you? Do you have a website?
We have a website. It's payfored.com, and there's a lot of free information out there. Again, we don't sell anybody's information, and there's some tools that you may find helpful, and we tell you to just visit there. And again, we have a great newsletter that we write that goes out once a month with 3 or 4 articles addressing the whole process, and I think that's what makes us different. We're giving you that holistic view.
Awesome. Thank you for doing what you do.
Yes, thank you for being on our show, Fred.
Great, guys. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. This has been Business Therapy, healing businesses from the inside out through communication and emotional intelligence. I'm Diane Dye Hansen, management consultant.
Sorry, crossing over. Christine Salvo.
And she's Christine Salvo, therapist.
And she's Diane.
Christine, you are off the charts. Have a great morning.